Alright, I'm working on my son's truck today, and there's a big old mess of rust right in here. There's actually not much metal left of what I cut out. There's just some thin strips, and this was all a big hole. And so I'm gonna weld some new metal in here. This truck is not one that we're gonna try to restore. If it lasts him 5 years, that'd be great. So I'm not even gonna do a whole lot. I'm not even worried. I did take my wire wheel and I wired wheeled the edges, but if I don't have all the rust out of the weld, I'm not that picky about it. Basically, I'm just going to weld a patch in here as best I can, and we'll roll this carpet back over it, and he's going to drive it like that. It's not going to last a long time, but this truck is not intended to last forever. We got it dirt cheap, and it needs some work, and we're going to tackle what we can when we can. And if later on he decides he wants to do this all nice and restore it, at that time we'll look at redoing the patchwork and getting it done. But for now, we got to get a vehicle to get him on the road. So to that end, with it having rained recently, I'm going to lay a leather apron down under the truck, and I'm going to try to weld some new metal in here today. I'm going to have to make a cardboard template. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, but we'll see. And I don't have to worry about grinding down the welds to make it look pretty. This is going to be under the carpet. I'm not going to grind any welds. I'm just going to make sure there's no holes, and we'll go from there. All right, I've got a cardboard template cut out, and this is going to be a flat piece of steel, but you can see this is not flat here. So basically I'm going to tack in the important parts and hammer it to fit as I go. It's not going to be pretty, but again, it doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to let this door seal here right where it's supposed to be. It needs to fill in all the holes here and support the carpet. And if that's done, I don't care. So, got my cardboard template cut. It's a little off in some places, but it's pretty close. And if I cut a little large on the steel, then I can come in and trim it as I go and get it in place. All right, got a piece of scrap steel here to start with. It's mostly the right size already. And looking at it, I think this is the side of an old freezer that I had, and it had paint all over it, and I wire brushed it off, and it's been laying under my bench for a few years. It's not quite all the way out to where I need it to be, but I'll weld the parts that I cut off here, I'll weld in over here, and I don't care if I have to do a little bit more tacking together to get this thing to fit, but it's a piece of scrap steel. It's just about the right size. It's not going to take a whole lot of work, and I'll start putting this in the truck. All right, the main piece is cut. I've got it laying over the template here. You can see there's this part here, and I'm going to have to find some metal somewhere to patch that. But anyways, this is going to be the main piece that I'm welding in. And I'm just going to hit it with a wire brush real quick and weld it in as it is. It's not real thick, but that section of the floor pan, the metal that's there is not real thick anyways, so I think it'll work. So I'm going to hit this with a wire brush and show what it looks like in the car, or the truck. All right, here's the piece in place. A little bit less confidence inspiring when I see how I'm gonna have to hammer it, but basically I've got it laid out, and I'm gonna tack it over here in this corner, tack it here, tack it here, tack it here, and then I'm gonna try to bend this line here down into this area here to meet. I don't care how good it is. I don't care how level it is, how lumpy it is. I don't care if the metal's stretched. I don't care if the metal's stretched. I just want to make sure that it fills in this area and drops down and meets here, and there's no leaks. Let's see where I get. All right, I'm ready to start welding. I've got the battery disconnected. I have a leather apron under where I'm going to weld to keep the splatter from hitting the ground. The ground's pretty damp today. It's been raining the last couple days, so there's not a whole lot of wind. It's not hot, so I feel confident I'll be okay welding out here. I also have my leather sleeve to wear. If you don't have one of these and you do welding but you don't like being hot and wearing a full apron, this will keep your arm from getting sunburnt from the welding. You definitely need one of those. I've burnt my arm several times welding, and that helps. My bottle is near empty. I've got a little less than 40 psi. Well, it's reading 40 psi, so it's about the right pressure for what I'm doing, but not much more. So I'll have to get a new bottle after this, more than likely. Got my extension cord laid out, nice big thick cable so I can weld on it. Welding 220, not 110, and I'm gonna get after it. All right, I got the first part of the welding done, and it was ugly at first. Check your welder before you start welding. I brain farted and didn't check, and I assumed I'd been working on sheet metal last, and so there's a lot of places I blew through until I realized I had my welder set a lot hotter than it needed to be. I've got to patch that hole there and that hole there, and then I can get on to, I'm going to hammer this area here down to where this meets. And then I'll trim some pieces to fill in here. This section here I'll probably just fill in with welding wire, and then I'll trim a piece to fit there. So it's coming along. Not pretty, doesn't have to be. But yeah, even guys like me, I make mistakes all the time. I should have checked my welder, assumed I'd been doing sheet metal, and didn't, you know, and I had an intention to look at the front of the welder before I started laying bead, and I just got too happy to be playing with the welder. So be mindful of that. All right, you can see here I've used the peen end of the hammer to hammer this down. This is pretty close here. As I was hammering this, more and more rust kept coming out. I wire brushed this earlier, but it keeps coming up with more crap. Here's a dirty little secret. You can weld rust. It's not pretty, it's not recommended, it's not very structurally sound, but I'm just trying to keep road grime and water out. So I'm gonna weld that nice clean piece of metal, that rusty piece of metal, and I'm not gonna care. So I've got this piece peened up here. It follows the curve fairly well, but I've got a gap down here I'm gonna have to fix. And I don't know if I'm gonna fix that with just filling it with welding wire, or if I'm gonna find a little strip of metal laying there. I'll probably end up using welding wire to fill that gap. I may have to come in here with a wire brush again, but again, all that paint and rust, as soon as it gets hot, it evaporates and you can weld right over it. Not recommended, but this is not structural. So, time to get back to welding. All right, here's another little cheat. I really didn't have any clean metal near the weld to clamp this onto, so I've just been holding this down on the metal as I've been welding, and that's worked pretty well. My bottle pressure is getting down to where I'm barely able to hold 35 psi, so I'm starting to get some pretty good splatter. I did fill all that in with weld. Basically just did a little U-shaped weld, let it cool, did another U-shaped weld, let it cool, and worked my way all the way across. It took me a couple minutes to do that. I started welding this gap here, and there's a seam sealer right here. And as soon as I hit that, my arc goes out. It doesn't conduct electricity. So I'm gonna have to get the wire brush in here and just wire wheel on this for a minute to get that cleared out. And then I should be able to weld this in. Did pretty good filling this in back here. That rust, there was one spot where the rust was thin and it blew out. And that's the only problem I know of, really, other than it not being structural. When you try to weld on rust, it tends to blow through. But I got that patched. It was right there. You can see the mess of weld there. But the whole rest of that welded in nicely, even with paint and rust being under there. So I've just got to cut a small patch for that. I've got to wire wheel out this section here and then weld this in, and I will have the floor patched, and I'll hit it with some paint. I'll hit it with some primer. I'll actually primer it. I'll wire wheel it off and primer it and paint it. You know, there may be some rust in the weld, but if I primer it and paint it and keep the oxygen out, it'll last for quite a while. I mean, that could last another 20 years if, you know, conditions happen right. Now, of course, if it gets used and abused and ends up cracking and gets air and water in there, then yeah, it's going to last just a couple of years. But, you know, you got to do what you got to do to get the truck down the road. All right, I got my little patch piece ready to go in there. I'm going to trim it down a little bit, get a magnet to hold it in place, try to make it a little bit flush. I am going to try to do some quality here. As far as this gap here with the seam filler in it, that seam filler's thick, so I ground out as much as I could to get away from the edge here. And I'm going to start up here welding it in, and hopefully as I go, the heat will boil out what is in there ahead of me. And it may not. I may have to wire brush it again, but we'll see how close I can get. All right, so I got my little patch panel welded in here, and I started trying to weld this in and just let it burn out the seam sealer. That seam sealer was way too thick and way too nasty. It was putting out fumes bad, catching on fire, and it wouldn't melt fast enough to get out of the way. So finally, I grabbed my hammer and chisel and just tapped it out, and it came out real easy. And so now I can go ahead and weld this in, and I'm going to have to use the same technique I used up here of just doing the U-shapes back and forth all the way down here. It's probably going to take me 10 minutes to weld this one bead. But if I can get this pound, I'm going to hammer this down a little bit lower, and it should meet right up with the seam of the metal down there. And that should be a good, nice, permanent weld. I'm going to get the wire wheel in here again because, again, I just knocked out that seam sealer and there's a lot of gunk in there, but I think it'll clean up nicely and weld nicely. So let's see. All right, so I got this back part welded. This front part still having trouble with. There's a lot of, you have a part come up from the bottom that folds in, and this part here that comes down and folds in also. And so there is a seam in there full of that seam sealer, and there's no real way to wire wheel that out. I chiseled it, but I'm just having to weld slow. Back here I was welding slow, and it was melting out as I was going, so it worked. So I'm just going to have to slow down up here. I have gotten most of that stuff out, so hopefully if I just take it easy and keep the heat low, it won't burn through, but it'll get hot enough to melt that out as I go. And I've got a pretty significant gap there to fill in, so I'm going to be taking it slow anyways. And I figure another 10 minutes of welding, and I'll have that gap full of welding wire. Now, there's a lot of pro welders out there just screaming at the fit up here, but you know, wire's cheap, and I got the time, so I'll get this done. Oof, that welding is ugly, but that got it sealed up. I am going to have to grind down some of these high spots because you'll feel them through the carpet. And here on this lip, there was a hole right here. I patched it, and I'm going to have to grind it down smoother. And then for the seal to ride down, there's a seal that goes right along here. And to get it back on, I'm probably going to have to grind some of this down. So I'm going to get my flap wheel on this and knock down these high spots, try to grind this down a little smoother for the seal to fit on there, and then I'll shoot it with some paint, and it's about time for me to wrap up to go to a church function. So we'll see what I can get done in the next half hour. All right, the welding and grinding are done. I did spot a pinhole, but once I paint it, that pinhole is going to fill in with paint. You know, if I were getting paid for this job, I might actually take more care with it, but not my truck, and you know, this is my free labor going into it. And granted, it's for my son, and I want it done right, but there's a certain point at which I just got to say, this is good enough for getting down the road for a while. So I'm going to shoot some paint on this now, and I'll look at it from the bottom side. It's probably going to look ugly. I'm kind of scared for that, but I'll get some pictures of that here in a minute. Well, maybe not as pretty as I hoped, but or not as pretty as I'd like, but it is as pretty as I'd hoped. So, little spots here where I got some welding wire poking through. And it looks like I got a decent sized hole there that I may have to patch. But as of right now, it's holding a lot better than it was before. So we'll see. All right, there we go. Nowhere near as good as new, but plenty good enough for what this truck will be doing. Now I just got to get the wire bracket back in place here and get the trim back on, lay the carpet back down. The foot piece here was broken, so we threw it away. So I'll have to get another one of those. But all in all, for a $1,200 truck, $1,300 truck, I think this is a good repair.